Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Harada. I am the Associate Director of the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University and the head of the journalism program there. We begin tonight by acknowledging that we are gathered for this event on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Peter Stursberg was a trailblazer, the first to cover Canadian troops in the field during the Second World War, the last living war correspondent from that era at the time of his death in 2014. For those reasons and more, his daughter Judith Lawrie and his son Richard Stursberg established an endowed fund with the journalism program at Carleton University. They're both here tonight. Please join me in thanking them. Judith. And right beside her, Richard. You'll hear from Richard in a moment. The fund, though, that Judith and Richard established supports two very special initiatives that speak to the legacy of their father. The first is the Peter Stursberg Award in Conflict Journalism and Media Studies. It will help outstanding Master of Journalism students at our school undertake a thesis or a master's research project on a subject related to media and conflict. The second is this lecture, for which we're gathered here tonight, the new annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondents Lecture is a first for Canada. And so in planning our inaugural event, I could think of no better partner than the Canadian War Museum. When I first met with Stephen Quick, the Director General of the museum, almost a year ago today, as a matter of fact, I prepared a quite lengthy spiel outlining all of the reasons why I thought a partnership would be a really beneficial thing for both of our institutions. And so, as I launched into my sales pitch when I met with him, anticipating that I would have to twist his arm, he leaned forward and smiled and said, "Yes, we're in." So this is why tonight I actually now have the very great pleasure of introducing Stephen Quick to you, to welcome you on behalf of the museum. Stephen.
Thank you, Susan. She just stole the best part of my speech, but that's okay. It's going to be wonderful. Ms. Doucette, Ms. Harada, Mr. Stursberg, Mr. Kennedy, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to the Barney Danson Theatre here at the Canadian War Museum during this Remembrance Week. Le musée est fier de vous accueillir ce soir et de présenter cette activité en collaboration avec l'École de journalisme et communication de l'Université de Carleton. In the first part of my career, I was fortunate enough to work on the Massey Lecture Series. As some of you will know, this prestigious event featured a leading writer, philosopher, historian, or other notable Canadian who would give a public lecture supported by a national broadcast and publication on a timely and important subject. Since entering the world of museums, I have been searching for the opportunity to offer just this sort of lecture platform, but until last year to no avail. A little over a year ago, I met with Associate Director Susan Harada from the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton, who wanted to chat about an idea that she was working on. And this is where the story links with yours. We met, we exchanged pleasantries. Susan sat across and started her sales pitch. She began with one sparkling sentence, rich with possibilities, but before she could start the next sentence, I exclaimed, to her surprise, "We're in, let's make it happen." And what she didn't say was, she then looked at me and said, "But I have a whole presentation to make." I said, "Well, you can go through it, but we're actually going to do it." And she said, "Oh, all right, we'll just move on." And so was born the Peter Stursberg War Correspondent Lecture that we are launching this evening. I want to applaud the insight and dedication of both Associate Director Susan Harada and Mr. Richard Stursberg and his family for developing this incredible event that honors the important work of Richard's father, Mr. Peter Stursberg. The Canadian Museum is absolutely honored to be collaborating on this evening's event, and in welcoming and congratulating this seminar's first guest lecturer, Ms. Lise Doucette. So welcome, and we are absolutely honored to have you with us. So why the Canadian War Museum, a museum of Canada's military past? Historians of military and social history and journalists share a common goal: to seek truth and be able to present it to a public audience. The historian, for his or her part, combs through the source documents, testimonies, and material culture left to us from the passages of time. The correspondent records history and experiences, the conflicts and aftermath as they happen. Historian and correspondent form a symbiotic relationship whose outcome is a greater and more visceral understanding of Canada in this, the 21st century, as it traces the fault lines that brought us here. And what better setting to present their collaborative effort than Canada's National Museum, dealing with armed conflict and how it has shaped this country. A museum that is the nexus where the past meets the present, a living museum. By presenting events like this evening, we open a dialogue on our world and how conflicts shape it and molds our country into the nation we know today. We are intensely proud to work with Carleton and play our part in the presentation of this prestigious and important seminar. Thank you for joining us this evening. Merci d'être parmi nous ce soir. I know that we're all looking forward to tonight's presentation. J'espère que vous allez apprécier la conférence ce soir. Merci.
I'm sure you're all familiar with the name Richard Stursberg. You probably know him best from his former role as the Executive Vice President of CBC's English Services. But tonight he's here in, I'd say, a more important role. He's here as Peter Stursberg's son. So please welcome him, Richard.
Since we're sharing funny stories, I hadn't planned to tell it, but I'll tell it anyhow. When I first went to the CBC, I think I was the first person to come and run the English side who came from outside the CBC, so I knew I would be warmly received. I knew I'd be particularly warmly received by the newsroom, which at the time was known as Fort News. But to try to assuage their anxieties, I thought I'll go down to the archives and I'll ask them to find a picture of my father with a CBC microphone. And I'll put it on my wall of my office. And that will convince them that I'm not as wicked as they might imagine. So this very picture was the picture that's had on the wall. It had no impact whatsoever on the news department. I would just say that my father was best known as a war correspondent. But in fact, he had a long career in journalism. After the Second World War, he was the first CBC correspondent to the United Nations. He was the Ottawa editor of the Toronto Star. He owned an affiliated radio news service. He was one of the founders of the CTV News Network. So he was very deeply involved in all this, and he wrote many books. It's interesting to your observation about history, the intersection of history and journalism. He wrote a series of histories. Probably the best known are his oral histories of the Diefenbaker regime and his oral histories of the Pearson regime. But all of this took place, most of this work took place in Ottawa. And the bulk of his career was spent here. So it seemed absolutely the best place to set this up was here in the journalism school in Ottawa. When we were talking to Susan, we talked about the fact that there is very little available in terms of advanced studies on how to cover conflict for journalists. And as conflict becomes less and less conflict between traditional armies and more conflict with non-state players of one variety or another, the ability to be able to figure out how to deal with these things and how to understand them, I think becomes even more important. So the purpose of this and the purpose of the fellowship that Susan was talking about is precisely to see whether we can open new ground in terms of understanding these issues. I'm thrilled that the War Museum, and Stephen, thank you very much, is part and parcel of this. And I'm also thrilled that Paul Kennedy is here from Ideas and that the CBC Radio is going to be part of it as well. Finally, I just have to say that Susan had set up an extraordinarily distinguished, I think it's fair to say, panel of journalists from around the world, journalists and news directors from around the world, to try to figure out who we should invite to be the speaker. And when Lisa's name came up, I think it's fair to say everybody said, that's absolutely the right and best person. Lise, as you know, is the senior BBC foreign correspondent. She's also Canadian. And I thought this could be no better choice, so thank you, Lise, for doing this. And thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I think there's a little video now. Is that right, Susan? So I'll vacate the stage, and the video comes on. Peter Stursberg was born in China in 1913. His mother was half Japanese and half Irish, and his father was a member of the colonial administration, the British colonial administration in China. So he grew up in a curious kind of imperial household of mixed race, and ultimately ended up in Canada when he was very early 20s and started his career as a journalist. He had become one of the very first people working for the CBC News. This is around 1938, and the CBC had just set up a news department. And of course, like he would have been at the time in 1938, 25 years old, say. So like everybody, every journalist of the period, when the war broke out, the number one thing they wanted to do was they wanted to go to cover the war. So finally in 1942, they agreed to send him, and in early 1943, he arrived in London. He covered them, first of all, in the invasion of Sicily, and then as they progressed up Italy and across the so-called Hitler line, so he followed the Canadian troops all through Italy. Then he followed the Canadian troops for the liberation of Holland, and then he ended up in Berlin just shortly after VE Day. And through the course of it all, of course, what he was doing was he was reporting on how the war was going from the point of view of Canada. And so it was the first time that people could actually hear what war sounded like. There's a famous piece of my father broadcasting from the Lawrie line in Italy, where you can hear him say, "Listen to the guns roar."
Just listen to those guns roar.
And then you hear the guns in the background. So it was actually allowed, and the Canadians were the only ones who had this technology, it actually allowed the Canadians to bring people into the sound of the war in a way that had never happened before.
We're in the attic of an old Italian farmhouse that overlooks the front as it's on a slight ridge. I'm standing here looking out of a hole in the wall that was made by a shell during the fighting here 2 days ago. This house, though, hasn't really been very badly damaged. It's the only one standing that I've seen for miles around.
Peter Stursberg landing in Sicily was the first time a Canadian broadcaster had covered Canadian troops on the move. He arrived just in time to cover the liberation of one of the key objectives of the Canadian force that landed in Sicily, the town of Agira, which was liberated in late July 1943. And so he came basically the evening of the battle and was able to get there when the town square had been liberated and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada pipe band was playing, the church bells in the background. It was able to broadcast for the first time Canadians liberating European city. after years of really bad news in the wartime news coming from the CBC and elsewhere, this was quite an event. During the Second World War, radio was the only electronic media. There was print reporting, there was certainly newsreel and film that had been around for some time, and photographic reporting was certainly available. But radio was at the cutting edge of technology. It was a way to bring, with only a few hours delay in some cases, or at the least a day or more delay, reporting of real live sounds from the battlefield into people's living rooms in a way that had never been the case before. This was done through very bulky, by today's standards, portable recording units that weighed dozens of pounds each, that were carted on a Jeep that could then be brought to a mobile recording van and all of this sort of thing. But the result was that broadcasters like Stursberg were able to lay live commentary over events as they happened.
It's a great honor for the School of Journalism and Communication to host the annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondents Lecture. We're in the business here of training young journalists, and down the road, some of them will likely end up reporting from conflict zones. The Stursberg Lecture Series is one way of ensuring that when they do, the journalism they produce will be smart and meaningful. Hearing from the best of today's foreign correspondents can't help but inspire journalists of the future to do their best, and hopefully their journalism will also contribute to more informed decision-making around the world. Well, as Richard mentioned, we have Paul Kennedy here with us tonight. You'll all know him as the longtime and award-winning host of that very wonderful CBC radio program called Ideas. Paul engages Canadians with, as he puts it, the core curriculum of contemporary culture. So we're all very fortunate that he's engaging with us tonight as the moderator of this lecture. Paul?
Thank you, Susan. I want to say first, it's a great honor to be here at the beginning of what I hope will be a very long lecture series going on until there are no wars, which would be a great idea. And maybe we'll do a show about it someday. I often find myself in the somewhat ridiculous position of introducing people who are more famous than I am to an audience who already knows who they are. And that's sort of what I'll be doing here tonight. So in order to prepare myself, I did what every good journalist did. I went onto the web this afternoon, found lots of Wikipedia stuff about this evening's lecturer. What was most interesting, though, is that what first came up was Lise Doucette's accent. And it was very interesting, obviously, to an international audience to try to figure out who and what she was. And it turns out somebody immediately answered, she's Acadian. And much of the response seemed to be trying to figure out how that relates to a Canadian. And it was somehow an economical way that we'd somehow figured out how to reduce that. And Lord knows what les Canadiens also are there for. And an international audience does not understand that. All of you people do, of course. And what I would like to say by way of introduction, by way of introducing someone who needs no introduction, is to say that that very fact, which was very much on the web this afternoon, not in the way that it perhaps should be interpreted, but was there, indicates to me that this evening's lecture is not just going to be about foreign correspondence and perhaps even war correspondence. It might actually be also a little bit about being a refugee. Because as we Canadians all know, les Acadiens, the Canadians, were refugees. And it brings everything full square right into a contemporary focus right now. I can feel it, the sort of lines are connecting, and we're looking at what tonight's topic is. And in very short way of introducing Lise Doucette, I think, to an audience that already knows her is that I think the most recent of the many, many awards she has won, and this is an honor this evening as well, but earlier this year in 2017, she was awarded in London something called one of the International Media Awards, which is a huge prize in London and very important in my profession. What's really interesting, though, is that her award in that category came for outstanding contribution to broadcasting. And that's a big, big thing to say about somebody, that they've made an outstanding contribution to broadcasting. But when you get into the finer print, it gets even more interesting. That award comes because Lise contributed to a better understanding in the world in general. And what that does, and this is where the crux of that award comes in, and why I think you should definitely put your hands together to welcome tonight's speaker. It was believed that that better understanding in terms of what a foreign correspondent does will actually create greater peace in the world. And that is what we do as journalists, I think, as correspondents, as people who work in war but not at war, about war. Lise Doucette has taught us that we are really looking for peace. And that's what I hope she's here to tell us this evening. Please welcome the first Stursberg Award winner, Lise Doucette.